You guys are not using a producer as most records have in the past. Is there anyone to say, hey, you should play that part like this, or take out that last chorus?
Well, Frank, Billy's a producer, I'm a producer, Bjorn's a producer, Mark's a producer. I don't know why we're not using a producer.
Can't find one, evidently.
There's not one around.
Welcome to episode 50 of the Hipsters United podcast. My name is Chris, and joining me this week are Jason.
Hey.
And Jill.
Hello, woo! 50!
Is this it? Is this the big 5-0?
This is the big 5-0.
Oh, it's time for a nostalgic look back.
To the HU podcast archives.
Well, we are going to take a look back, but sadly not at our own history. Since our archives are well documented, you can find all of our old podcasts on hipstersunited.com or on iTunes in the feed. But Billy is still working feverishly in the studio on the Tear Garden material, so we are going to spend this week taking a look back at the decade that was, or still is, or the decade that is about to come to a close, the aughts. The 1990s were pretty kind to Billy Corgan, as he was met with both popular and commercial acclaim, and I would contend that even as his later albums, Adore and Machina, didn't reach the commercial heights of his previous work, his stature among critics arguably grew a little bit. I mean, Jim DeRogatis referred to the Machina album as one of the strongest of their career, and we had talked previously about the positive reviews that were garnered by Machina II from The Onion and Pitchfork as well. But in the current decade that we're in, as this decade has progressed, Billy has seen his commercial failures continue and has become either a subject of derision or an outright laughingstock to many critics. So before we kind of move on and go through the decade, Jason, do you think this is a fair assessment of the turn of the century? I mean, I would contend that when the Smashing Pumpkins broke up, they did so on a critical high note. Would you agree with that statement?
I would qualify it. I think Adore is the critical peak. I think Machina got much less acclaim than Adore. I kind of think Zeitgeist got almost as much acclaim as Machina, maybe not quite. I mean, I hear what you're saying about DeRogatis, and I know his prominence in Pumpkins history for having been called out by Billy is high, but I think when you look beyond him, I don't think that the acclaim is maybe quite as broad as you might be characterizing it. It's true that Machina 2 was well received, but I also am not, and to throw a second thing in there, I'm not entirely sure about classifying Machina in the 1990s. I'm pretty sure both albums were released in 2000, so that seems to be in the aughts to me. Or are you one of these people who holds to 1991 to 2000 or the 90s?
No, I'm with you. 2000 is the aughts.
Okay. So, I mean, it's
Not to completely dismiss those people as crazy or anything, right?
Yeah,
Are you one of those people?
Well, if you're going to call the decade the 90s and include the year that ends in 00, I think that's that's stupid, yeah. Anyway.
Relevant detail.
Derailing the entire conversation. But, okay, but that sort of, in a way, makes your claim even stronger, right? Because if I'm saying that Adore is the peak, and then I'm classifying Machina into the next decade, and I'm saying it didn't get as much acclaim, then, clearly, this time period is associated with less friendly audiences and less friendly critics for Billy, so...
Well, Jill, I know you've got Metacritic pulled up. Does it have any numbers for Adore on there?
Ooh, I did not pull up Adore, but I can certainly do that really quickly.
Because the Metacritic score, just for everyone listening, is a perfect statistical expression of the average of every critic's views.
It's the tomato meter of music.
That's right. And if you put Metacritic into the archive search at hipstersunited.com, you will only find one post from me where I completely blast the concept behind their website.
I actually don't think, at least from doing a Smashing Pumpkins search on Metacritic, that it goes back that far.
Yeah, 1998 is a long time ago.
In terms of the internet history, for sure. It goes back to Machina and Machina II, but not anything earlier than that.
I think
So
1998 is pre-spfc.org. That's a long time ago.
yeah. So really the only, or the earliest review that we have, like, for at least Metacritic, sort of a compilation of critical scores is Machina, which received a 66 Metascore on a scale of 100 and a user score of 9.0.
The users, they just love that. They love everything.
Yeah.
So the critics, I mean, one of the interesting things about Metacritic is that it publishes sort of snippets from many different critical reviews of albums. And, this publishes reviews from places like Q Magazine, which I don't read on a regular basis, claiming that Machina is, quote, mostly a wonderful rock album, all the way to the review from Spin, which says, quote, confused and lapsed Pumpkins fans have reasons to rejoice. This is a necessary welcome return. Unfortunately, Machina does linger a bit too long on the softer side of things. But every time the tempo veers towards screeching to a halt, there's a well-timed boost of adrenal sound. And then, and keep in mind this is still Machina we're talking about. Rolling Stone actually gave, both Rolling Stone and Spin gave Machina a 70 out of, well, either they gave a 7 out of 10 or Metacritic assigned it a 70 out of 100.
Yeah, I think Rolling Stone is out of 5 stars.
I think they're both out of 5 stars, so that's 3.5.
Yeah.
So Rolling Stone says, quote, the songs go back to the basics of would-be hit singles, riffs, hooks, bridges, choruses, often with voice and guitar tossing the same short phrase back and forth. Corgan hasn't radically changed his songwriting. He still goes for anthems, riff rockers, and dirges, but there are no more fantasy epics or muses named Daphne, and there's hardly a keyboard to be heard. Guitars rule, distorted electrics and hard-strummed acoustics, sitar-like drones and orchestral reverberations, tolling Pink Floyd tones and jabbing, wriggling leads with plenty of echoes of The Cure and U2. So, florid praise from Rolling Stone.
What was that? No fantasy epics? I thought Machina
No
had...
more, yeah.
Did they skip Glass and the Ghost Children like I usually do?
Like, okay.
By contrast, Pitchfork and some of the indie rock media folks did weigh in on Machina. This was kind of, if I remember correctly, they were just getting started or had reviewed this after the fact.
As many of our readers can probably guess, I could quote passages from memory from that Pitchfork review. Something
but
about
the one that Metacritic chooses to publish is Billy Corgan needs someone on his shoulder to whisper, no.
Oh. Yeah, that's the infamous Brent DiCrescenzo review.
But by contrast, when Machina 2 came out, Pitchfork actually said, quote, it would be extremely easy to dismiss this album as Billy simply taking out the accumulated garbage of the past couple years. It would be easy, that is, if it didn't almost redeem the Pumpkins. This album features an abundance of tracks that throw the deficiencies of their previous record into even sharper relief.
Man, so backwards.
Yeah, I remember when we talked about Machina 2
a
couple of months
ago. Our
ago.
listeners will remember that none of us are too sympathetic to it for huge fans.
Yeah.
But it's the huge fans that are the most blind. It's right. The experts at Pitchfork who know so much about the Pumpkins, to whom we should listen.
So was that Machina Pitchfork review, was that after the fact, or was that at the same time? Because I think that kind of is germane to the discussion here if we're talking about when the critics turned on Billy.
Oh, that was contemporaneous. I mean, they were around. That came out
at
the time of the album, yeah.
I know the Machina 2 one was.
Yeah.
So still pretty generally good reviews, though it sounded like, at least, I mean, the Rolling Stone one was definitely positive in terms of Machina.
Well, Rolling Stone and Spin, I don't think have turned on Billy. Yeah, I mean, this question of turning on him is a strange question, because there's, this question of, what they rate his albums, and then there's the question of, do they think he belongs as a member in polite society? And it seems like during this last decade, there's been a large movement by spearheaded by these younger critics to just kind of spread the impression that Billy Corgan is a crazy man who shouldn't be around the rest of us. Is a danger to children or something. And I think that is the most pronounced shift because Zeitgeist, as I've tried to say many times, and people don't seem to believe me, but the evidence is everywhere, did not get these horrible reviews. It got mixed reviews. And if you think about Pitchfork specifically, as I do, I think the people at Pitchfork would love nothing better than for a Smashing Pumpkins album that was total crap to come along so they could give it a 0.0. But they gave Zeitgeist a 4.9. And if you read the review, they basically say that it's a great hard rock album, but the Smashing Pumpkins were so much more than a hard rock band, and therefore, this album just doesn't reflect the entirety of the band, right? I mean, it's so funny because Pitchfork is always trying to criticize other music criticism outlets like Rolling Stone for being sucked in by the PR and stuff. But Pitchfork on the Zeitgeist review, in my opinion, they totally got sucked in by the oh my god, it says Smashing Pumpkins on it, right? And so suddenly Zeitgeist had to be this complete statement of the Smashing Pumpkins, and it couldn't just be a hard rock Smashing Pumpkins album, right? By contrast with Adore being a quieter album, or Siamese Dream being a really lush produced album, right? So I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to say that the music, I don't think, has gotten slammed quite as bit as nearly as so much as Billy the Man has suddenly become a punchline.
Well, and there's this weird, and I'm not exactly sure where that comes from, because I tend to agree with you, Jason, but there seems to be this thread, at least in the reviews I've recently read, which sort of lambast the band or Billy Corgan's work after the band broke up in 2000. By that I mean reviews of Zwan and of TheFutureEmbrace and so forth. There's this sort of thread through some of these reviews that refuses to let go of the sort of victimization that Billy Corgan allegedly perpetrated against James Iha and Darcy Retsky Brown. That's right. There's this weird almost allegation via these reviews that sort of faults the music for events past, even though the events past sort of happened amicably. Darcy left the band when she wanted to, and James left the association on a high note after the Metro show.
Yeah. Well,
so where is this victimization? And
it's
Jason,
now in use of the name,
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's where most people see it now. But to say that it's new is kind of, were people not saying this, not only during the original incarnation of the band, but also in the period where it was broken up? They were still saying things like that.
Well, I don't remember any reviews that came out of Adore or Melancholy or anything like that. You didn't really read anything like, well, this album was great, but it could have used more James, or anything like that. It does seem like, though, and especially starting with the next step on our journey here is in 2001 when Billy started Zwan, and they, of course, had their one studio album, Mary Star of the Sea, and it actually was pretty well received by critics. Rolling Stone gave it 4 stars. Entertainment Weekly gave it an A-. Pitchfork gave it a 4.8 out of 10. And in Pitchfork's review, they talked about how Billy treated his bandmates like second-class citizens and drowned them out of the mix. They said something about, I should actually pull it up to quote it, but they talked about David Pajo specifically, saying that he wasn't given room to do his solo guitaring.
To do his brilliant.
He says, quote, Sweeney is, in fact, actually, let me move back one sentence. How fare Sirs Paho and Sweeney? Not terribly well, but not necessarily through any fault of their own. Despite their distinctive styles, pinpointing their contributions to Mary Star of the Sea is exceedingly difficult, indicating that they've met a similar fate to that of poor old Darcy and James Eha, who rarely escaped overdubbing on Pumpkins albums. Sweeney is, in fact, nowhere to be found, though I swear I can hear Paho's textured noodling a couple times when the fray lets up. Yet before he even has a chance to step up and prove himself, his soloing is abruptly blown, in italics, out of the mix by Corgan's guitar histrionics.
Well, that's all true, though. I don't dispute that at all. You know, do you guys? I mean...
No, I mean, factually, I don't know that it's incorrect, but the way that you, term these criticisms is, I don't know.
It's one thing to say that they're great
dramatic
musicians that deserve to be higher in the mix or something, but it's another thing to compare them to James and Darcy. Because it seems like, I mean, like I said, I don't remember reading in any reviews of the Pumpkins' earlier work that, oh, if only this album had more Darcy, if only I could hear more bass. You know, like, no one ever made a big deal about it.
Well, maybe at those times more people believed that they were playing their instruments. That's possible.
When did that first come out, that Billy was doing everything?
I don't really know. I mean...
I know that when he started doing his internet autobiographical blog posts in 2003 or 2004, he savaged both James and Darcy pretty well, but I think it was pretty general knowledge before that he was playing all the instruments.
I mean, my recollection was that, you know, it was semi-openly expressed by Billy and other members of the band that they contributed much more to Melancholy and Adore than they had previously. Does that ring a bell to you?
Especially Adore.
Yeah, I mean, they talked about this a lot, like, wow, we were playing Shame together in a room, and
yeah,
you got the sound of all of us, and, you know, like, not spelling out that was a brand new thing, but, you know, it was still pretty clear. But, you know, this sort of, you know, James and Darcy as fragile human beings who, you know, were abused by Billy Corgan, I mean, I find that really contemptible. I actually find it totally insulting to James and Darcy, which is ironic, because the people who say it think they're defending James and Darcy, when actually I think they're just totally insulting them, and they're not really achieving much beyond that, to be honest. I mean, like you guys said, I think James and Darcy got away from the band, like Billy said it himself with regard to the reunion and those members not wanting to, you know, James and Darcy not wanting to be part of it. He said both of them saw the band as something, I think he said this, but okay, someone will have to find this, but somebody said something like, they see the band as something they got away from for their own reasons. I'm pretty sure this is what Billy said. And that, to me, rings completely true with everything I've ever seen. You know, that, believe it or not, James and Darcy are adults with their own wills and desires. And anyway, have we kind of lost the train of thought here?
Well, that was the Zwan era, where the reviews were still mostly positive, but already it was starting to come out about, oh, poor Billy really needs his old band members to be, or needs his other band members to be more of a focus. But after the breakup of Zwan is the era when Billy discovered the internet as a means to communicate personally with his fans, and he used this new forum to kind of speak ill of former band members, both from the Smashing Pumpkins as well as Zwan. And he used the website to post a series of autobiographical entries about his early life that revealed early physical and emotional abuse. And in the same time period, Billy released his poetry book, Blinking with Fists, which garnered fairly negative reviews. And soon afterwards, he released a solo record, TheFutureEmbrace. TheFutureEmbrace received pretty mediocre reviews, and it seemed like, to me at least, in reading back over some of these, that Billy's online openness got reviewed almost as much as the music did. In Rolling Stone spent, like you said, Jace, I mean, Rolling Stone has still been pretty pro-Billy. I don't think they've ever really taken him to task too much, but they spent the opening paragraph of their review of TheFutureEmbrace discussing his blog entries. So, I mean, it does almost seem like, you know, is it as simple as Billy Corgan opens up and the critics turn on him?
That's an interesting question, Chris, because I think that when when you open up, you definitely make yourself more vulnerable to criticism. And maybe there's some aspect of it. Because, I remember as early as 95, 96, hearing things from, either my schoolmates or friends about, oh, did you hear the last crazy thing that Billy Corgan did? Or, in recent memory, people rehashing Lollapalooza stories about what a big jerk he was on stage or whatever. And it was easy because there was very little access to the band or to, any alternative music personalities really at that time, in knowing what they were like as people. So the moment that you actually open yourself up to being known as a person, as we can see with the multitude of, websites and TMZ-like shows that completely expose people for who they are, people either don't know what to do with that newfound information if their opinions are already set, and I think the media had a pretty set opinion of who Billy Corgan was at that time. So to open up and add sort of new information to the mix probably was just confusing. And people don't generally tend to give things a fair shake if they've already dismissed them in the past, right?
I think, the way the media kind of operates with regard to any story and a person in some sense is a story. There's kind of this period of when the person or the story breaks on the scene, the media is like hashing out their narrative.
Right. Who are they? What's their motivation? And
then basically the narrative gets set, and then there's no real reason to revisit it. Revisiting it is just an expense, and it's costly. Like you would have to re-research, and then you have to talk everyone out of what they already think, and that's just like.
And you'd have to question your journalistic integrity.
An enormously expensive process that there's very little motivation to undertake, because at that you've convinced your audience at that point, and so you're not only challenging your peers, you'd be challenging them to go rewrite history, right? To tell people, oh, we got it all wrong, and what you think is wrong. Billy Corgan is not the same person we portrayed him to be, right? I mean, that's nobody wants to hear it at that point, basically. And we could talk about the reasons why Billy, the initial narrative on him was what it was, and I'm not saying the narrative on him is totally wrong. Obviously, there's elements of it that are right, but just in line with what you're saying, Jill, by writing a bunch of stuff, it's just like another thing that he did. I mean, we've kind of commented on this phenomenon ever since we've been running the blog. Every time Billy does anything, it's like there's a fresh wave of people going, "Oh my gosh, what a loser!" and it doesn't even matter what it is, And I think that just suggests, that the fundamental narrative of Billy Corgan, crazy person, or whatever you want to say the narrative says about him, is already set. And all new information is just going to be viewed in a way of, confirming what people already think about him, right? It even has a name, confirmation bias. In the literature.
Well, and talking about when he kind of went off on James and Darcy in those blogs, it almost seemed like he was saying, well, I've been covering for them all this time, but now I'm going to tell the truth, and I need to get this off my chest and everything. It seemed like he was trying to kind of divert. He was kind of feeling the people saying things like, oh, like poor James and Darcy, and was trying to kind of explain himself, but it got totally twisted around the other way. Instead of people saying, oh, well, no wonder Billy was recording all the instruments. James and Darcy didn't do anything, and he had to, poor Billy had to attempt to keep this band together. It was, oh, now he's attacking them. They just made people feel even worse for James and Darcy.
First he was oppressing them in the studio, and now he's, coming out and attacking them on a blog post. It's unbelievable. And what he thinks he's doing is saying, look, this is why I might have had conflict with them,
Yeah.
But again, the narrative of it is so insulting to James and Darcy. They're not even people. They're just little babies, and the idea that they could have been engaged in some sort of conflict with Billy is just like, it's like dismissed. It's so odd, because the same sorts of people who say these things, they always claim that like James and Darcy played this vital role in the Pumpkins of like guiding Billy and focusing him on his best work and all this shit, right? It's like at the same time, James and Darcy are these incredibly weak, fragile people who Billy just tyrannizes, and then they're also responsible for reining in his worst impulses and helping make the Pumpkins great. It's just totally incoherent to me.
I think the poetry book also kind of opened the door for a lot of criticism. I mean, for some reason, it's always seen as pretentious when someone who's successful in one field tries to branch out and do something in a different field. I mean, as an amusing example, whenever basketball players try to rap, they are often and usually rightfully savaged by the media. And we all remember Shaquille O'Neal's brief foray into rapping in the 90s. And I mean, Billy Corgan writing poetry was seen by some people, I'm sure, as equal to Shaquille O'Neal acting and rapping. I mean, here's someone incredibly successful at one thing, and they wanted to take a chance and try something different. What an egomaniac that Billy thought that he could be a poet also, along with a musician.
Yeah, because Billy's attitude when he put out the poetry book was, "This is great."
Yeah.
He just came out and said, "I'm the greatest poet of all time. The world will shit." No, of course. I mean, I thought he was pretty humble in offering the poetry book. But.
Yeah.
I think that I think a lot of this backlash, or not even backlash, but defense that Billy has had to make is because the media and his detractors have really pushed him to do so, though. I mean, I would argue that, at a certain point, you as a human being trying to defend yourself, you have to reach a certain point where, you put up a good defense. And a lot of what we have been talking about with regards to the backlash about being honest about the situation with James and Darcy, et cetera, the reaction to his poetry book, all of this sort of negative attention that he'd gotten back in that era, I think really probably caused him to try and fight a battle, or so it were. I think that, Jason, you had brought up on an earlier podcast, maybe it was 2 podcasts ago, one of the recent comments that Corgan had made on Everything From Here to There about how he fights his battles. I brought up the quote just to think about it because I think it's especially relevant in terms of looking at his media outreach or his blogging, his reaction to some of this criticism. And ultimately, it seems like, those battles have been very hard fought and really done nothing to increase his critical standing or have people understand him more. He said, quote, "Most of the major battles I have fought have been over the way someone perceives me, which triggers my need to correct them. Defense is usually the same as attack, for it comes from the same root of belief that there is an idea or principle that must be defended, or else something bad will happen to me. But again, what if you decide that your piece in the matter is worth more than your name, your reputation, or your hurt?" I think that sentiment is maybe what we're seeing as a result today. Because I think a lot of these, projects that he did in the past to defend himself really he saw as fruitless.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying, Jill, about the kind of when people in the public eye open up and we get to know more about them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think, like, what other... A lot of it is probably because I'm a huge Smashing Pumpkins fan and not a huge fan of other artists, but what other artists do we know this much about that are on Billy's level of success? Like, if you look back at his contemporaries, do we know this much about the personality of Eddie Vedder? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I would imagine Pearl Jam fans do.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. I wonder if we just see more of it with Billy because we all follow Billy's career.
I mean, there's a number of... I would... Even though this might be a stretch, like, I think there's fairly substantial divide in the media between who likes Springsteen and who doesn't like Springsteen. I mean, Springsteen is probably more generally well-loved, but I think there's a pretty substantial contingency of critics in probably the 80s and 90s that dismissed his work. That's a good question, though.
For anyone else out there that's listening to this, if you want to add to the comments, for those of you that follow other artists as much as you follow Billy Corgan, it'd be interesting to hear if there's other artists that get kind of the same treatment for opening up about themselves, or even if there's other artists who have opened themselves up like that.
Well, I think now, the majority of artists that are kind of coming of age right now, they don't have a choice. Like, that's kind of the difference between now and then, is that there aren't a lot of people from back then that are still making music now that kind of came from the same place. We have a lot of artists like U2 and a lot of the sort of really commercial, really highly prolific or visible artists that have been sort of in the public visibility for a long time, making sort of top 40 music, not necessarily rock or alternative.
Yeah, and those who are from that same place, they and their fans and the younger critics all seem to not want them to make any more music, which I find so bizarre. But, like Pavement is like, don't worry, we're not going to make a reunion album. And all the critics and their fans are like, thank God they're not going to make another album. So weird to me. It's like, they're going to, don't sully your legacy. Keep it perfectly.
Well,
and I'm just thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool to have a few more good songs? I mean, even if you don't like everything they do, or even if, God forbid, some of the critics don't like it, like, I mean, I feel really bad for, I'm just going to say, like, regarding Zeitgeist, it's just really terrible that there are so many critics who didn't like it, it really has kept me from enjoying it. I'm joking. Like, I really enjoy it. I'm glad they did it, and the fact that, some people out there consider it to be sullying legacy this, legacy that. Like, I don't give a shit. I mean, I do care, but I don't care. It doesn't affect my enjoyment of Zeitgeist. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It would never. I mean, if you told me the Pumpkins are going to put out another album, but it will be widely perceived as sullying their legacy, I would be like, I'll take the album.
Yeah.
And to think that some people would not want the album because of that is so strange.
I have a strange comparison. I've been trying to think of like top 40 artists that sort of have had critical rebirth or whatever. How about Mariah Carey?
You're going to have to explain to us, I think, Jill.
Yeah.
Well, surely you've heard of years ago when she had like a psychic meltdown and basically was all over the tabloids because Mimi had to get sent to the mental institution or whatever it was. She had all of these granted, I'm not sure this is a great comparison because she is obviously a solo artist, but I think she was pretty highly acclaimed prior to this sort of mental incident. And now she's she received really negative press for a good probably 3-4 years and has kind of made a comeback. I don't know if that's because she was in kind of a different demographic, a different top 40 sort of, maybe people in the top 40 division are more likely to forgive. I don't know. I just thought it would be kind of hilarious to compare Billy Corgan to Mariah Carey, but
oh, we're laughing. I'm just teasing.
Jessica Simpson is having to reinvent herself right now, too. Going the country route.
She should look to her good friend Billy Corgan for help.
I mean, Britney Spears had the famous meltdowns and getting her head shaved and all that, and now she's had a comeback. I would say that she's been pretty successful recently.
Yeah. At what cost?
Is what's happened to Billy anywhere remotely common?
No. But in terms of...
This is part of why the whole indie thing, like, what I call the indie catechism of Billy Corgan's supposed sins, I mean, it's why it's such a joke to me, because there's, like, nothing there. It's like, what has he done? You know? Like, remember that guy from Penn State who was like, Billy Corgan has released a book of poetry. What an asshole. You know? It's just like the whole list of his sins is just, it's such a joke. It doesn't add up to anything. It's just so strange.
I think
he got in an argument with Sharon Osbourne.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's, and not even, I mean, sins is a strange word maybe to attach to it, though the way people write about him, it's not. But, you know, even if you go with, you know, the supposed evidence for his mental instability or something, I think a lot of people put on it that video he made for the wrestling thing, which is hilarious. And it's like, people are like, I mean, some people interpret that as like a Britney Spears shaved head moment or something, you know, or Michael Jackson dangling his baby or whatever. Maybe those moments aren't all they're cracked up to be. I mean, that's what that's what I take away from it, as you know, as opposed to anything else. So. Yeah. Maybe Britney thought she was going to be in a movie and she had her head shaved, and I'm just joking.
Well, but what I think that you guys are maybe teasing my particular, my possible point. I think that Britney actually is a good example because she is sort of the extreme example of what media attention does to really convolute reality and sort of, I don't know, it actually manipulated her reality because she went from, you know, a young innocent pop star with very little controversial past to full-on 24/7 media attention, and I think that manipulates a person. So I think to a certain extent the argument that we were having earlier about pre-internet versus post-internet and what opening up your life to sort of the discerning or not so discerning masses can really have a big impact on how you yourself interact and have to sort of defend your reputation. Because if you don't feel that your reputation needs any sort of defense, that's going to be regarded as, you know, your outreach about it is probably going to be regarded as egotistical or
compounding it. In some
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Unless you just lay down and take it, which I don't think any of these folks in the music business are probably willing to do. They generally have talent.
That's pretty unnatural.
Yeah.
I mean, who does that? You know?
Well, I saw Mike Tyson on Oprah Today do it, but I think
just lay down and take it.
Pretty much.
But that's sort of like, I mean, I think is what you're suggesting is that, you know, maybe Billy has kind of reached that point, and I was going to say, you know, that seems to be kind of a late stage, like, once you're through it, you know, that's the point you kind of reach, right? Is that, you know, I can't do anything about it, nobody's listening to me, so fighting it, continuing to fight it is not helping, right?
Yeah.
And some people seem to think, oh, you should just go straight to that point, you know? You should just take our abuse and never fight back at us. You know,
right.
Which makes sense that people would say that because you're trying to talk someone out of fighting against you, right? I mean, you know, of course these music critics don't want people to be criticized. They don't want to be criticized, you know? And, of course. So they're going to, you know, they basically, I don't know, what I'm saying is that, of course, the people who are criticizing Billy Corgan are going to criticize him if he ever criticizes them for criticizing them, right?
Yes.
It's just like two people yelling shut up at each other. No, you shut up, right? Like, why are you getting on my case now? I was just reporting it as it is, you know, which is such a load of shit. But I feel like this is going to be somewhat out of step with the rest of the podcast, but I wanted to offer really quickly why I think... I mean, because I think the obvious question from some of the things I've said that people would ask is, well, you know, you say that this narrative about Billy got established, and, you know, the implication is that it's wrong, but I haven't really said why I think it's wrong, or how it would have gotten established if it was wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say shortly, and people can argue with this, but the reason I think it is kind of a false, or a much more negative portrayal than probably should be, is that I think music critics are mostly people who want to be musicians or want to emulate musicians or see musicians as heroes. And Billy, being a very ambitious person in the Chicago scene, alienated other musicians, you know, because he was basically saying, I'm too good for this scene. I want more. I want out of here, right? We're going to become big stars because I'm very talented, right? And that's pretty offensive to other people in a music scene, right? You know, that you're implying that they're not good or they're not good enough, right? You know, Billy has said this a million times. He said it overtly, and I mean that would even infuriate them more. You know, when he was trying to describe the Chicago scene, he would just out and say, yeah, it was a bunch of people who were satisfied with playing in Chicago, and we weren't satisfied with that. Well, so of course the musicians hated him, right? And if you're a wannabe, you're obviously going to pick up and hate who they hate, right? Like, the cool people are the musicians in Chicago. I'm a music critic. I want to be cool. They hate Billy Corgan for these, you know, for whatever reason. I pick up on that they hate Billy Corgan, and then I write like I hate Billy Corgan, you know? So I think that's where it starts from the beginning of the band. Simply Billy's ambition alienates cool musicians, and people who write about music like cool musicians and want to be like cool musicians. And so I think it's as simple as that. It starts from there, and it just like that's the setting of the narrative, right? And for the reasons we've said, once a narrative gets set, it's too expensive to try to undo, and there's no real point to undoing it. I mean, you don't really get a reward for undoing it as a journalist. So that's it. That's the claim. So that's why I think that the view of him is so negative in the press.
I think they did kind of undo it, though, in the mid to late 90s. It seemed like once Billy became incredibly successful, that the critics couldn't keep trashing him, because clearly he was very talented.
Boy, I would only say partially. Partially and temporarily got undone.
I would agree with the temporarily.
I mean, it's a halo of commercial success. I mean, you know, you can't argue with 4 million records sold in some sense.
Right.
You know? I mean, that's the thing. That's the weirdest thing, and something I've been thinking and saying. If Billy suddenly has a huge hit right now, or a huge album, I mean, you will see the critics lighten up. Which is so ironic because they generally, you know, try to profess this sort of special knowledge that the Joe Schmo music fan doesn't have about what's good, right? But Joe Schmo's, like, in his numbers, does change the critics' opinions, you know? Siamese Dream and Melancholy aren't the best reviewed Pumpkins album and most fondly looked back on. I mean, like, the biggest reason for that is that they sold the most, you know? I mean, but they sold the most. If they sold the most because they were good, that means that Joe Schmo fan can tell something, you know? And so it gets all jumbled up. But
I guess the best test of that was how well was Siamese Dream reviewed when it first came out, before everyone knew that it was going to sell millions and millions of copies.
I think pretty well.
Yeah.
But, you know, not gushingly, by any stretch.
Not to the point that it's looked back on now.
Oh, not at all. I mean, Rolling Stone gave it like 3.5 stars. The New York Times gave it like an okay review, like not even good, I would say. You know, Derogatis gave it 3 stars or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and now today everyone's like, oh my gosh, that was the record. But why? It's because people who are grown up now were teenagers then, and they thought of it as the record. You know, and now those people are 30 and writing for Pitchfork, and they all think Siamese Dream was the greatest thing ever. But the thing is, at the time Siamese Dream came out, what did the people who were 30 think of it? They just thought it was okay, you know? Which to me is kind of interesting, because what do the people who are 30 now think of, like, say, Zeitgeist, right? Oh, it's just okay, you know? So, that calls into question both things. It calls into question, is Zeitgeist only okay? And it also calls into question, is Siamese Dream that freaking great? You know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess we'll find out when the people who are growing up now and grew up during Zeitgeist become music reviewers.
Oh, I don't think they'll have very fond recollections of Zeitgeist because it didn't have the commercial success. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the commercial success at the time the people who are 30 now were teenagers that makes the people who are 30 now look back on Siamese Dream so fondly. Right? I know this is hard to understand.
Oh, it makes sense to me.
Is it, though?
Is it looked on fondly? Siamese
No,
Dream?
is it the commercial success that makes them look back fondly on Siamese Dream?
I think so.
It
Mostly.
can't just be that they connected with the lyrics and the music was new and different, and I mean, I don't buy that commercial success.
That is the success. They were 16. They didn't know any better. Like, they connected with it Like in the way that kids now connect with My Chemical Romance or Fall Out Boy or something that the 30-year-olds are trashing. When those kids grow up and they're 30, they're going to be like, yeah, My Chemical Romance, that was a great classic album. Or that's maybe not the right example, but something like that is going to be true, I think.
So then we quickly fall into the discussion of what makes an album transcend decades. I mean, I don't think kids getting into Led Zeppelin right now are sort of convinced by Led Zeppelin's long-standing commercial success. It's good music, right?
If it was just good music without commercial success, though, would any kids nowadays be exposed to it?
I mean, sometimes stuff that's good obviously gets reevaluated. I mean, that does happen, and that's great. But I'm not arguing that Siamese Dream is not good.
No, I understand, but
I don't know if it's so titanically great. You know, it's really good, but you know, if Siamese Dream was coming out today, Pitchfork would give it a 6.3. I mean, I just think that's obviously true. You know?
Oh, really?
Yeah, I really do. I don't think there's any way they would have seen it as so great. I mean, the equivalent of them at the time didn't. I mean, that's the whole thing we're saying. The New York Times gave it a very middling review, you know? And, you know, Rolling Stone didn't give it a great review. Nobody was fawning over this. I mean, you know, some people thought it was really good. I think Melancholy got better reviews, just from recollection. That could be wrong. But, I mean, reviews were solid and good, but not like they were. I mean, you know, if they reissued it right now and it was remastered wonderfully, I'm sure Pitchfork would give it a 9 point something. You know, it wasn't that level of oh my god, this is brilliant when it came out. Mm-hmm. But then again, Jill, what I'm kind of saying, I'm kind of talking about initial reviews. You know, an album comes out and it's reviewed like pretty quickly. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, but then a year from then, after it's had several hit singles and it's sold 4 million copies, well, see, then it's like the commercial success is then going to feed back in. That's the whole point of the argument, right?
Yeah.
It's like, is the commercial success coming first or the critical respect? And I think the commercial success absolutely inflated the reputation of Siamese Dream.
Forces people to get on the bandwagon for fear of not being.
Something like that.
Well, and it must be a lot harder to review things nowadays because there really aren't bands that are as big as the Pumpkins were in the 90s.
Well, that may say something about why I'm grasping for, like, what were those lame-ass examples I just offered, like, My Chemical Romance, this is going to happen to them. I couldn't come up with anything.
Yeah.
You know, because I don't know of anything that's become, like, a huge buzz with the kids. And that could be because I'm old. But it also might be...
MIA?
There aren't many people that are getting that huge with the kids. Is she really? She hasn't gotten that big. I mean, the things that Pitchfork and stuff talk about, they aren't that huge. Like...
They're micro movements.
Yeah. You know, the Animal Collective is like the biggest hyped thing this year. How many kids bought that album? It's not very many. You know, it's incredible. It's compared to Siamese Dream, it's a blip. You know, Siamese Dream sold 4 million copies in America. Nothing today is doing anything like that.
If you're 15 or 16 and listening to this podcast, you should leave us a comment. Let us know what you're listening to.
What's hot with the kids? Tell us old people.
Man, I can't even look at the top 100 alternative charts. It's crazy.
There's still alternative charts?
Yep.
Chris, are you going somewhere in specifically next, or can I kind of ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. There's, you know, we're spending this podcast looking back at the decade, and a lot of these music critics, they do something that, you know, we on the blog don't really like, but they come up with these things that are like, you know, it would be one thing, as I've written, to come up with a list of their favorite music and be kind of humble about what that means, but instead they try to come up with the best music. This is the best music of the last decade. And given that they do this, you know, Pitchfork, for example, recently did the 500 greatest songs of the 2000s, and Billy wasn't on the list, of course. And I want to know, and I have my answer, and, you know, given that these lists exist, and given what Billy put out this decade, do you think he should have been on that list? And if so, why? What song? And you know, kind of take what the lists are as a given. I'm not really asking you guys to think, oh, well, I think such and such song is so great. Because I think you guys understand, these lists are kind of socially constructed. Like, nobody really votes for their favorite song, They vote for, I don't know, it's kind of like a presidential election. You would vote for yourself, right, if you were voting for the best candidate. But, there's no way everyone in the United States thinks that either Barack Obama or John McCain were the best people to become president in 2008. What I'm saying is an election is a sort of coordination mechanism. We coordinate on things that are acceptable in some ways, right?
Right.
And you're ascribing a cultural significance to your selection.
Yeah. So, given that the lists are what they are, did the critics miss a song that Billy did that should have maybe had that significance, and that because they really... it's like DeRogatis said recently in that Keeping Score in Chicago podcast, like, Corgan's really fallen off the radar, so it's like, because Billy has fallen so far off the indie/pitchfork radar, did the critics actually forget something that should have been on that list, or do you guys think it's right that just basically nothing had that significance that should be on that list?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what even qualifies. So if we go back to Zwan, I would think honestly at least would qualify for inclusion on a list. I'm not saying that it belongs on a list. Lyric, was Lyric a big enough single?
Yeah.
I don't know. Those are the only...
I think you're tending toward the answer I would choose, though, because remember, Chris, Machina was released in 2000. So,
yeah.
So see, because this is my answer, is that they forgot Stand Inside Your Love, which I think is generally understood now to be among the best Pumpkin songs.
Yep, and I would have done the same thing, though. I really, for some reason, mathematically, I know that 2000 is part of this decade. Just for some reason, it seems like another era.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like that was before the boy bands and before the rap rock, the Limp Bizkit, and all of that. It was before the indie rock.
Was it before Limp Bizkit? I don't even know when that was.
I think it was around the same time.
Sonically, though, probably, Pitchfork, they love to think of themselves as very forward-thinking, and there are certain sounds that are like now and moving forward, and there's some songs that are just sounds that are like in the past. And, I can imagine that part of the reason a Stand Inside Your Love might be overlooked is that it kind of embodies that past sound. You know what I mean? It really very much is that alternative rock, Smashing Pumpkins sound that, like it may have technically been in the 2000s, but I'm sure they're thinking, well, that's just like a backwards-looking selection, to pick the song. So that might explain but not justify the exclusion of it.
Yeah. But what about anything?
Should have included Glow.
Glow is a good song. That comment is going to generate the most, or that remark is going to generate the most comments on this podcast. Jason thinks Glow is a good song.
Did anything from TheFutureEmbrace make it big enough to... there was a single, but was it ever on the radio? Did it have any cultural impact?
No.
I'd have to agree. I never heard it on the radio in Kansas City.
You're not even naming the song. You can't even remember what it was called.
Walking Shade.
All right. You win. And then, obviously, Tarantula.
Right. Which,
I know, Chris, you and I, on the merits of the song, we think yes. But there's no way, given the reception of Zeitgeist, there's no way.
Yeah, I think that falls into your category of, well, we would all vote for it because we like it, but did it really have the impact of a best of the decade song?
Well, that's a song you could vote for, though. As a single, you could vote for it.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone would expect it to be on there.
Yeah, I definitely can't really take anyone to task for not including it.
Yeah, but I kind of would a bit for Stand Inside Your Love. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would too.
I wouldn't slam them. I'm not like that's one of the best 20 songs. I'm not doing that. But I think most everyone thinks that's a great song.
Yeah.
Even detractors of the band, I think, can see that one. Yeah.
But I think
Jeremy Pins of HU concedes Stand Inside Your Love is a great song.
I think that the band in general, though, suffers from sort of disjointedness over the last at least cultural disjointedness over the last decade, though. I think that they were never intended to have a song in the, a song in the culturally relevant top 100 tunes of the aughts, or whatever the crap you want to call this kind of a project. Because they Billy Corgan did Smashing Pumpkins Part 1, he did Zwan, he did TheFutureEmbrace, and he reunited the band. There's no cultural narrative to get back, to get behind. It's way too hard. Yeah,
this is all, I'm not saying it's Billy's fault, but this is pathetic. We're not even going to try to say that, they made any sort of cultural impact. Cultural impact may not be necessarily what you're going for, but if he was going for it, Billy didn't succeed at all.
And I think he even said about Zeitgeist, it wasn't meant to be this grandiose work. It was supposed to be reform the band, kind of get, a rock album to get it under their belts so they could build off of that.
Yeah.
It was kind of the Gish of the reformed Smashing Pumpkins.
Yeah. I totally buy that, actually, because I think very similarly about Gish. I don't think it says much more than "Let's rock."
Yeah.
And you, this is actually a perfect setup for the few notes I'd taken in advance of this podcast, Chris, because aren't Billy's two most ambitious albums the ones that people think most highly of? Isn't Siamese Dream? They're ambitious in different ways, because Siamese Dream is ambitious in sonics, right? Like, we're gonna make the best sounding rock album ever, and then Melancholy is ambitious in scope, right? And I think those are his two most ambitious, like, unrestrained, go for it albums, and those are the two that people like the best. And what's so odd about that is it runs counter to so much criticism that gets expressed of Billy, Like Dirigatis recently, again, like just the latest person to saying, Billy Corgan really needs an editor, Well, when he was at his least edited, those are the albums that everyone thinks are the best,
Right.
And I think there's something totally to that, and I think when you look at what he put out in this decade, which of those albums, Machina, Mary Star of the Sea, TheFutureEmbrace, Zeitgeist, I think Machina is by far the most ambitious, but it's still, it's, sonically and conceptually it's pretty ambitious, but I don't think it's as sonically ambitious as Siamese Dream. And the problem is that, the concept of Machina is just too hard for so many people to relate to, because it's this really, well, Billy is trying to, in some ways I see Machina as the artistic equivalent of all this, Jill, you've been saying all this stuff about Billy fighting back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Machina was like, I actually think it's in some sense, it's the first attempt of his to fight back, and he tried to fight back in the form of an album.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, in the form of the concept of the album. It was totally lost on everyone, and that the theme of it was so personal and had so much to do with being a rock star, being famous, and et cetera, people just couldn't relate to it. And so, for all its ambition, it was just unrelatable, and most people didn't even understand what it was about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, so there you go. But every other album, so Machina is ambitious, but it fails because of this, like, conceptual unrelatability. It failed with audiences. I don't think it fails as a piece of work. But all the other three albums, I think they all have a real unambitiousness about them. Mary Star of the Sea, I'm actually going to say I would actually blame, in part, the other band members, which I know is ironic. But, the whole vibe of Mary Star of the Sea was like, let's get together and jam and not try too hard, have a good time, Which is like this really kind of an indie mindset,
Mm-hmm.
And, he had some indie rockers along for the way. And, so not only was it, I think it's sonically not ambitious, it doesn't seem to have much of a concept going on, except, like, good times. And it also has the problem, as every fan knows, that it's totally fucked by the loudness wars. The mastering is just horrible, and it sounds like shit. And also, I think, Billy, I do think it tries to sound too much like the Pumpkins, which is, I know that's a bizarre complaint, because Billy has said that, the whole time he was trying to make it not sound like the Pumpkins, but it was going to sound like the Pumpkins anyway. But I don't know. When I went to Zwan shows, they always seemed more bluesy than the album I thought turned out, you know? And I always was disappointed by that. So I kind of blame Billy. Yeah, I do. Okay, so I don't think that album is very ambitious. The Future Embrace is kind of sonically ambitious, but not really in a way that anyone was used to or wanting. I mean, you know, Pumpkins fans want to hear those roaring guitars. They just do. They can deny it, but they still do. It's like crap. I don't want to hear anyone say that they don't want to hear that. I'm sorry. But, you know, and there's, what's the concept of the Future Embrace? It is me, unvarnished Billy Corgan without a shirt. I mean, I don't know. I don't think there was much there. And
I don't
Chris,
think it even had the atmospherics of Adore. I mean, Adore was... It didn't have the squealing guitars or anything, but I think it was a lot more artistic and a lot more interesting than the Future Embrace.
Maybe. I would probably rather listen to the Future Embrace than to Adore. I'm sorry. Why do I have this blog? Nobody would agree with me. But yeah, and you already nailed about Zeitgeist in terms of lacking ambition, so I don't think... Though I would say conceptually, I think Zeitgeist is not as bad as people think. I think Zeitgeist, with some people, I think the reception is damaged because people assume that it's kind of this really generic, like, pro-peace, anti-George W. Bush album, you know? And I don't think it is. I think it's a genuinely conflicted album, you know, as manifest in, like, Forgotten Country, which a lot of people interpreted, again, as just this kind of generic, like, wish for peace or something. And I think it's conflicted and interesting. And I think United States is conflicted and interesting. And I think a lot of people thought it was like Pearl Jam, you know? Like they had that song Bush Leaguer or whatever, which was like, George Bush sucks! You know, like, right in the title. And, you know, I think people just, Zeitgeist comes out at the time it does, and they look at the cover, and they hear some loud music, and they're like, yeah, George Bush sucks, I get it, Mr. Rockstar, duh.
Yeah,
you
Green
know?
Day just did this.
I know, and that is cool. On. So I just think it's very I think it got underestimated and got a bad rap on that account. But
I think that the band, or that Billy, was too subtle in the way that he posed Zeitgeist for it to make any sort of impact beyond face value. The sort of give peace a chance crap. Like, I think that internally to Zeitgeist, you had this narrative of ambivalence, or, like you said, Jason, conflicting feelings towards your own role in promoting a cultural zeitgeist. And and as a side note, do we even want a zeitgeist in the world, or are we super happy with where we are? Like, these types of narratives are really difficult to express through rock songs. Maybe long prose and, lengthy diatribes of editorial content, but it's less effective when it comes off via a huge rock song with a wall of noise, and so the subtlety is totally lost. Like, I think I probably, if I wouldn't have, started a blog about the Smashing Pumpkins and started really listening for content and trying to figure out what motivated them in that album, I might have missed it myself, because it is subtle. It's like the people, listening to Melancholy going, oh, this is so immature. Why is he writing about being a little boy and growing up in the heartland? And
I do want to say that I don't want to say that Zeitgeist is this brilliant, coherent statement of some sort of concept. I mean, I just think it got written off as something it's not. Right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that what it is like really good. And I certainly don't think the artwork helped in any way, because and we have Billy's new website, which obviously shows that a lot of his political views are what I would term lacking, what Chris would say are lacking, that aren't necessarily that great. But I thought what Billy was trying to say on Zeitgeist was like, it was an expression of yeah, I can't even say it, but he just not buying into simple answers, and the tug toward God and country is a real one, and that's what Billy was kind of saying in that song,
Mm-hmm.
like in wartime it seems bad, is what he was saying, kind of, but yet these things are real, right? And so, you know, in his limited way, he was trying to grapple with that. I mean, he's not a guy who's ever really made political statements. You know, that was something that some people correctly latched onto as zeitgeist. It was, wow, Billy Corgan is trying to talk about bigger issues, right? He's not so introspective. He's more outwardly focused on this album, and that was correct, right? And someone who hasn't really thought a lot about those things is going to get a lot of that stuff wrong. But, you know, some of the bigger things I think he had kind of right. You know, I think that, you know, just to, you know, as I've kind of said before, and this is obviously my personal views, but, you know, the kind of generic leftist view that most rock stars have, I think is really simplistic and lacking in a lot of ways. And I think that's what Billy latched on to. You know, I mean, obviously I like him, so of course this is part of why I like him. You know, I think he recognizes that there's an errant simplicity about that, right? Now, what to do about it, he doesn't really know any better, right? But he wasn't out there. He's not part of that parade, you know? He's not out there with Eddie Vedder and Bono and Thom Yorke. I went there. I mentioned Thom. You know, with the kind of generic leftism. He's just not. I mean, that doesn't mean he has a specific political philosophy or any answers or anything, but, you know, I just think Zeitgeist got written off as that when it's not that. So.
Well, and I think that misunderstandings about the actual point of albums generally results in critical confusion or, you know, people dismissing entire bodies of work because they don't know what it means, talking about the media in particular. I was actually reading this really interesting article this week about Georgia O'Keeffe, the painter, and you know, it kind of reminded me in some respects of Corgan, strangely enough, and I promise this isn't going to be another Mariah Carey non sequitur, but...
Yeah, please don't do that again. I'm joking.
Basically, when Georgia O'Keeffe first started showing her work, they had never really, you know, people, the contemporary art culture had never really seen anything like it before. She had these, you know, crazy colors and undulating lines, and there were, you know, so many new colors being used that really were not familiar to the sort of contemporary periods of the time, or sort of styles of the time. She ended up, and she received really good critical acclaim at that time because of the new stuff that she was doing. She ended up hooking up with this guy in New York and his Stieglitz, who ran a gallery, and he was kind of an avant-garde photographer and pretty well known here, and she ended up falling into an affair with him, I think in the 30s. Well, actually it might have been earlier than that, like in the late teens, early 20s. I might be getting the timing of it a little bit incorrectly. But, you know, her critically acclaimed work kind of led to this relationship with Stieglitz, who at the time was going to show her work. And he was a photographer and ended up taking all of these, you know, nude photos of her in really erotic situations, etc. And she, you know, being an artiste, was totally fine with this as a sign of self-expression. But because of her work and sort of her public image at the time, she received lots of, you know, terrible publicity about it, mostly on a moralistic basis. You know, what kind of a hussy lives with her proprietor who runs her gallery and allows to take all of these nude photos of her in suggestive positions. And so the moralistic criticism that she got from the contemporary media was completely ascribed onto her artwork. And so now, today, one of the contemporary criticisms that you hear over and over about Georgia O'Keeffe's work is that really all of her paintings are of vaginas, right? Because she's this lusty, wanton woman who, you know, and even during her lifetime, her work was completely dismissed as being this hussy, basically. So the media had it in, and she went on to do very different things in sort of the twilight of her career. Like the work that she put out was much, much different than kind of what we know as a Georgia O'Keeffe piece. And so she never really shook off that bias, I guess. And it's interesting because, you know, that reputation still persists today. So I think, if anything, it's kind of a parallel comparison to really what power, you know, if you kind of leave the contemporary cultural dialogue, there are a lot of things that can be said about you that can persist as truths for a very, very long time.
Oh yeah.
Even if you're actively trying to dissuade people, and you have proof.
Yeah, I don't think people should be waiting around for Billy to be critically or culturally rehabilitated. I really don't. I mean, you can hope for it, but I wouldn't put too much, like, you know, and people, you know, some of our readers, if you're still listening, because this has been a long podcast, but some of our readers may think, why is Jason saying that? Doesn't he have this whole blog, and like one of the themes of the blog is like fighting back against the critics? And like, what is the point of that? Because he's saying, don't have hope that things are going to change. But listeners, it is about us feeling better about Billy. That's what the blog is really about. It's about to say, look, critics in this instance are uninformed. In many instances are uninformed. In virtually all instances are underinformed, or something like that, right? And so we as fans should feel better that the music we are listening to is perfectly fine. Maybe even very good. Not that means anything. But, you know, that you shouldn't feel bad about liking this band. And, you know, that's really what it's about. It's not like I think that by criticizing Pitchfork is going to turn around and, like, the culture is going to embrace Billy Corgan, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's going to happen. But for those of us who like him, I don't think the reasons that the people who don't like him are very good. And that's what it's really about, is documenting that, right? And it's for our sake, not for their sake. Pearl Jam's song "Not For You" is a much better song than Bush League. That was a big reach, I'm sorry. Anyway.
Well, that sounds like a good way to end it this week.
Are you saying that the whole podcast was a big reach?
No, I meant Jason's final comment about...
For more of Jason's asides and ventures into direct address of the audience, please stay tuned to the post-podcast show.
Wow. We're going to start doing post-children podcasts.
I've sometimes thought about that. Like, Chris, can we just do a 10-minute podcast right now about something? You know, like, I don't know. Maybe that's a bad idea.
Maybe. Let's just get a live stream to Jason's monitor on the sidebar.
Podcast 50.3.
And again, now I want to make another direct address. Readers, you probably are thinking that if you had a direct stream to my microphone, I'd be like, fuck those fuckers! I'm gonna fuck them! You know, like when I read something, they start yelling. I don't think that's really true, but then again, we haven't tried this. Could be true. Maybe when I read Pitchfork, I'm just Do I even read Pitchfork, though? Do I really read that?
Well, thanks for joining us this week. Feel free to leave your comments on the blog about any of the things that we talked about, especially if you're 15 or 16 and want to tell us what's hot with the teens.
Paramore.
Muse. I hear that's what the kids like these days, and Glenn Beck.
Any music from the Twilight films?
Does Glenn Beck have children?
Ooh.
I don't
Don't
know.
answer that question.
Well, our closing song of the week this week is The Camera Eye, one of Billy's solo songs from Sydney, Australia on July 28th, 2005. Good night, everybody.
Listen, there's no mark I cannot place. There's no wish I dare not be. Time uncovers what is keeping still. I unaware move against my will. 'Cause I'm insane as I'm mine. Passions wane, stragglers weep on the spine. With the camera I hold, so I'll never let you go. Stay with me for a while I see madness bleeds, grace my spine, walk on through the camera eye. Listen, listen, it's the name I cannot speak. It's the flame I dare not douse. Yeah, things out will never get that far. Close enough to die in time, or 2 or 3. Scratch my skin, rest the skies. Baby, in town, but hide, oh hide. The powers it change in the camera eye. Who needs pain to survive? I need pain to change my life. In gentleness and eternities, we own the very truth. Haunted shoes, my wet dream, the naked soul just has to breathe. 'Cause if I bleed, camera cries. No one down the camera eye. Move fast forward with the camera eye. Move fast forward through the camera eye. 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 The camera eye.
The Hipsters United podcast is not affiliated with or endorsed by the Smashing Pumpkins, Virgin Records, or Warner Brothers Reprise Records. All opinions offered by panelists or guests of the Hipsters United podcast are their own and do not represent the opinions of the Smashing Pumpkins. All audio during the show is licensed for non-profit use per the terms and conditions on the Live Music Archive at archive.org. Intro music is from the Machina II album released for free download on the internet by the Smashing Pumpkins in September of 2000.